Greetings, friends. So today, actually, we're doing something different. We want to welcome our friends, Catherine Akbar, who will be actually the one who is leading the meeting today and interviewing. Actually, Ramzi is a part of. There's so many things that we're common together with, so many friends, and also like we went to the same school many years ago, maybe like 10 years ago. So it's a pleasure to be with you today. As thank you for coming and being part of the Kumi meeting this week. And Catherine, and Ramzi.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Omar. I appreciate Kumi and Sabil hosting us today. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you. So, Ramzi, what would you like to tell us about yourself and about your experience as a Palestinian Christian in America?
Hi, Catherine. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you, Omar, for inviting me and making this whole thing possible. And thank you, Ryan, also for the nice poster and the website and everything. This is the book, if you haven't seen it. I was born a Christian in Palestine, and that simple term, I put it this way because that simple term, Palestinian Christian, when I came to America, everybody was thinking that's an oxymoron. So, you know, my Allah is very often confused with the Muslim Allah, and we're lumped together. The last time I chatted with somebody new, I met someone at a bar, and he was, you know, he knew I was from the Middle East. And as soon as he found out I'm Christian, oh, thank God, that was his reaction. So my whole life, I guess, I've been trying to come to grips with the fact that I'm a Palestinian Christian. That same book that I believe in, the Bible, is used by other people as a blueprint to oppress me, as a sort of deed or right. And so I try to look at myself and say, okay, how do I define my own connectedness to the land? And that's one of the aspects of Fugitive Dreams, is I try to illustrate that connection that every Palestinian Christian has to the land of Palestine and to its history and to its future. I mean, if we look at the numbers, Christians in Palestine are a tiny minority right now, but in reality, Christianity itself is indigenous to Palestine more so than any other land. That's where Christianity originated. Now, I'm no theologian, and I'm not a biblical scholar. I like to read a lot about these matters, but most of my Bible I learned from a young age. My grandmother started me reading with the Bible. So here I like to talk in this hour somewhat about my struggle with when I was living there, with the fact that our book was used to oppress us, that it was filtered down to a doctrine of supremacy and promised lands. And that doctrine was then used to disenfranchise and dispossess us as Palestinians. And then the second part of the book, the character travels to America, and that parallels my life when I traveled to the States in 1990. And I was shocked at how many churches, not everybody, of course, but there's quite a few churches who have pro-Zionist beliefs, who cast the modern conflict in Palestine as, you know, Israelites and Philistines, and of course we're the ones on the bad side. So that's where I want to begin.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Ramzi. Well, I'm glad you brought up the Islamophobia. As a Christian Arab American myself, I've also experienced that. And it's an awkward position for people to put you in, but I'm glad to, you know, to tell them, hey, I'm glad that you're happy that I'm Christian, and I'm equally respectful of Muslims, and I hope you are too. I mean, obviously they're not, but you can always put it out there.
Right. There's nothing wrong. These comments come at you, off the wall. You're not expecting something. Then someone blurts out something like that. Like, oh my God, they actually. So.
Yeah, it's sad. So tell us a little bit about the book and the themes that are in it.
Okay, the book is a story about a typical Palestinian, Samir, who is born in Palestine in the early 70s when the occupation was still new. And the first part of the book, he's a child. He's growing up in that environment. And I tried my best to capture the point of view of the child. How would a child born there learn about the conflict and get to know what was going on? How would Israeli soldiers appear like from a point of view of a child? And so he's born under occupation. He lived under occupation. He's denied freedom. He travels to America, eventually settles there, becomes an American citizen. But when he goes to Palestine, he's treated as a second-class person who's not wanted, who has to apply for a permit to go to Jerusalem to visit his place of birth. And so the second part is contrasting the freedoms he has in America with the extreme oppression that's still there in Palestine, that even though he's an American citizen, he could still get to experience. And then in the third part, he has a daughter born, and that daughter forces him to confront everything. He takes her on a trip back home to visit her grandparents. And when she's 5 years old, she asks him to tell her about the Israelis. She wants to know. And suddenly he feels the weight of the world on his shoulders. What is he going to tell her? How is he going to tell her? How is his approach going to be, and what story to tell? And what he really is on his mind is her own future. He dreams of a better future for her, and that conflict has gone on too long. And so his focus in the third part is, how do we get out of this mess?
Beautiful. And, I've known you, Ramsey, for a long time, since college. So when you gave me your book, I planned to read it out of a sense of obligation, but I have to say that it was such a gift, because it is a really beautiful book. And when I say beautiful, I mean in the human sense. I mean, sure, it's about the conflict, and it's very interesting from that point of view, because it's a firsthand account about growing up during the Intifada, but also it's very holistic. As you mentioned, I never thought about what it's like for a child to start to understand what's happening around him or her, particularly in such a fraught time. And also, as you just mentioned, the sense of a parent. What do you tell your child? You don't want to teach your child hate, as the Zionists often accuse Palestinians of. At the same time, you want her to understand that, these folks have been your enemies and have done your people grave wrong. So I'll just share a few things that I loved about the book and encourage everybody to get the book, not as a service to Ramsey, but because you will love it. And before I forget, any questions, please put them in the chat and we will address them either as we go or at the end. But a few things that I loved about the book. Number one, it's so very honest and personal. And I love that. It includes the awkwardness of an adolescent figuring out how to relate to girls and trying to show off how tough he is, and many other things. Secondly, it's politically astute. in a way that I didn't quite expect, given that your personal background is in the science field, the physical science field. It really raises a lot of issues that I hadn't quite thought about, and I owe that to your wide reading on the subject, such as how the conflict makes people rich. I mean, it's obvious that it makes American arms dealers rich, but it also makes Arabs rich, and that's an interesting thing to look at. Not Palestinians, of course, but Arabs in other countries. I loved also the sense of irony in the book. Like, in particular, I was amused by the thing about the Jordanians haranguing Palestinians at the border for having Israeli bought clothes because they felt that Palestinians should boycott all Israeli goods, which ideally would be great, except that there isn't always the opportunity to fully do that and get the goods that you need. And secondly, later on, under the peace accords, they were forced to put Israeli labels or put their own labels in Israeli clothes. Fourth, I like that you talked about shared responsibility, not to create a sense of equality that the Palestinians and Israelis are equally responsible for the conflict, because I don't believe that is the case, but that there is responsibility. There are things that Palestinians, both individually and collectively, have done that have not helped their cause. And I love that you very honestly took a look at those things instead of just taking a partisan approach. And finally, something that I loved about your book and that I love about Palestinians in general is how much they love the land. I don't know, growing up as an American suburbanite, I had no love of the land. I mean, I love my country, but I don't specifically feel a love for the land like Palestinians do. And as a child, you talked about, well, you say it's the character, but to me, it's you. Anyway, the character is traipsing through the land outside his house and examining all of the bugs and the trees and the flowers, and that was just extremely charming to me. So I know you wanted to talk about the biblical allusions in the book. What are some of the themes that you put in the book that relate to Christianity specifically?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned I talk about the environment, I talk about social growth and stuff like that, but a thread that you could maybe see throughout the book is also what's it like being a Christian and going through that. And one of my own personal goals was wanting to reclaim the Bible itself as our book and find my own connectedness with the Bible. So after writing the book, I looked through it and I counted at least some 30 to 35 biblical allusions and quotations. And I will give a few examples. One of them, for example, the donkey. We all know that Jesus on Palm Sunday rode a donkey to Jerusalem. And I take that idea and I bring a donkey back and forth throughout different parts of the book. So very early in the 1970s, when that character is a child, the milkman rides to Samir's house in Ramallah on a donkey. Every day he comes on his donkey carrying milk from the nearby village of Kalandia. And in the 1980s, one of his friends comes to school early. They have to go for a school trip very early in the morning, and there's no public transportation, so he rides a donkey from his village. So in this first part of the book, the donkey is a symbol of connectedness of the Palestinian life at that time with the biblical past. By the end of the book, the donkey recurs, but this time in a poem by Salem Gibran, which I translated. And the poem laments how birds and animals and even the sun can cross the border easily, but not the refugee, not the son of the land who is exiled. And I add the idea that with the wall in place now, not even the donkey can go across the border. And at the same time, Kalandia itself, that village where the milkman came from, has become synonymous with that dreaded checkpoint between Ramallah and Jerusalem, that new gate that the Israelis built in the wall. So the invader is the one that severs that biblical connection, is the one that prevents that donkey from moving and builds this wall. And in the name of reestablishing biblical Israel, they destroy the biblical character of the land. A second very similar theme is the road to Jericho, which occurs in the Bible. And I mentioned that it's associated with the inn where the Good Samaritan has entrusted the man that he saved. So in the Bible, it's a symbol of love and hope and brotherhood. And I mentioned that road to Jericho many times throughout Fugitive Dreams. You see step by step how that road is gradually widened, redirected, hills are cut, and it ultimately passes under the shadow of this big settlement called Ma'ale Adumim. And there's also a grove of decapitated olive trees there. So again, the biblical thumbprint on the land is effaced by those invaders who are doing it, ironically, in the name of the Bible. So as we speak right now, the biblical shepherds along that road to Jericho are being evicted by the Israelis, who go and destroy their homes and destroy their schools, and Palestinians go back and rebuild, and then the Israelis come next week and destroy everything. So again, how can they claim ownership of the Bible when they're against that? Third example I just want to go through, and then I'll turn it back to Catherine, is the fig tree. So early in the book, Samir mentions how the parable of the fig tree assumes a palpable immediacy when you look outside your window and you see a fig tree right there. So that fig tree outside his window, I capitalize it throughout the rest of the book. I personify it as its life unfolds alongside his. He knows that tree personally and played in that vacant lot where that tree is with his friends throughout his childhood. Its fallen leaves are harbingers of snowfall in the winter. But then when you fast forward to the end with Ramallah's rapid growth, the fig tree is still there. It survives the construction trucks for a giant building next door, and it survives a fire. But it's very threatened because all those empty lands are threatened by that growth and overdevelopment and this constrained environment that's created by the wall. So the tree is the last living being to speak in the book. It speaks, it becomes symbolic of sumud, of endurance, of the land, of ancient wisdom. So I'll turn it back to you, Catherine.
All right, wonderful. So we're getting a lot of interesting questions in the chat that we'll get to soon. What did you want to say about Palestinian village names and the Bible? You know, when I went to Palestine for the first time in 1993, I went to the international summer program for international students, which I highly recommend to anybody who has a college student or who wants to take a summer sabbatical. It was an amazing program. They took us all over historic Palestine, and they took us, at that time, we were able to go to the Gaza Strip. We went to refugee camp there. We went to refugee camps on the West Bank. We went to destroyed villages that had been planted over with trees in weirdly straight rows. We went to a garbage dump that was on top of a Palestinian village. And one of the things that we also did was go to Kufr Kenna, which they told us was the biblical Cana, where Jesus performed the first miracle of turning water into wine, which was pretty exciting to me as a Christian, and to find out the contemporary issues, which are that the people from that village have been expelled. They are internally displaced Israeli citizens. For reasons known only to themselves, the Israeli government does not allow them to return to their village, but they do, to live in their village at least, but they do go back to the village for weddings and funerals to honor that connection to their historic homeland, home village.
Wow.
What else is in the book about this topic?
Well, I was reading the Bible, and in the book of Joshua, chapters 11 to 16, you have lists and lists and lists of names of existing Canaanite cities and villages at the time of the Hebrew conquest. So this is around 1200 BC. And I was interested in those names. So I put those names in the Bible side by side with a map of Palestine. And the very names of the Palestinian villages speak of that continuity of culture because they're very similar. They're the same biblical villages that were there even before Joshua, even before King David, before Solomon, before all of that. Those villages and cities were there. I even made a spreadsheet. In the book, I only mention a few of them. For example, and the interesting thing is that when the Israelis came to the West Bank, they built their own settlements and they gave their own settlements biblical names. So now if you look at the map, you have this double vision. You see Ramun, a Palestinian village next to Rimonim, an Israeli one that uses a slightly more biblical sounding name, less Arabized. You have Giv'on and you have El Jid. So I use the example, the most poignant one is Beit Ur. It's in west of Ramallah. And in Palestine, we had two villages called Beit Ur the upper, El Ulia, Beit Ur the lower on the hill. And if you look at the Bible, you find an upper Beth Haron and a lower Beth Haron. So they're recognized in the Bible as two villages. Whereas the Israelis came and built a new settlement they called Beth Haron, which is a Disneyland version of the biblical landscape. You know, it looks like something taken out of California and planted in the middle of there. You know, different type of construction and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that there are Palestinian connections to the Old Testament, which is very interesting. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the most visible one is when I was a kid and somebody bought a new car or built a new house. What do? If they can afford it, they get a lamb and they slaughter the lamb at the doorstep. And then they take a hand, put the palm, dip it in the blood, and put it on top of the door, on the lintel. And that practice is so biblical, it's so reminiscent of the Passover, where you take the lamb and put the blood on the door to ward off the angel. So Christians and Muslims in Palestine are continuing to do that. Maybe in more recent years, it's become more difficult. But so that's one connection, a remnant of the Passover. I include allusions to Samson, Abraham, Jacob, and Esau, Solomon's judgment, Judith, Elijah, and more. I try to use language like of the Jordan River, for example. In 2005, I wrote, takes only 2 seconds in the sky to cross this border that has tormented land travelers for 40 years. And adding later, as Samir surveys the West Bank hills from the castle of Ajlon in Jordan, Nablus perhaps was on the other side of the valley, a day's walk at most. For us, it was a cataclysmic divide, waiting like Moses to enter the promised land. So here, the travails of the Hebrews wandering in the desert for 40 years, I illustrate how these are replayed daily in the lives of Palestinian refugees exiled from their homes for even longer than that.
What are your thoughts about talking to Christians, this is a question someone posed in the chat. What are your thoughts about talking to evangelicals about this? Have you thought about that?
Yes, actually, I mean, a lot of my comments in the book about Christianity were aimed at evangelicals, if they got to read it. I have found that it's possible to talk to individuals who are evangelical and get them to change their mind over a long period of time.
All right. So one of my thoughts as I was reading all of this about growing up during the Intifada, which I know you did, I was wondering how you feel that being Palestinian has shaped you as a person. And I know that's probably a hard question to answer, because how does anybody know what shaped them as a person? But you've probably put some thoughts into that and your healing process. So tell us about that.
About who or what shaped me?
Being Palestinian.
Oh, it's a difficult thing, because when you spend your whole life in that environment, you know, there's many different trends. I talk about victimization. And this was something I felt more when I left to the US and started getting involved in activist groups for Palestine. Is activists like to, it's their job to communicate that injustice that's going on in Palestine to other audiences and to make other people aware of what's going on. But in that process, activists tend to emphasize the victimization of people. So they portray Palestinians as victims. And from the point of view of being a Palestinian myself, the last thing I need to be thinking about myself and feeling is myself as a victim, because once I consider myself a victim, then, well, there's nothing I can do. I might as well just resign and receive handouts from the UN, which is what the pressure was on the Palestinians, you know, since 1948, was to sit in refugee camps and collect handouts. And some people get caught in that and some don't. So I consider myself fortunate to have lived during the Intifada, and because that taught my generation a lot about not being a victim, about resisting, about standing up, and defining our own will and doing what we can to exercise it. So for me, as I say in the book, adversity is not a curse, but a school. Whatever difficult experiences I survived, I can learn from and become stronger.
Beautiful. And do you have any closing remarks for us? Because we have a lot of questions.
Oh, please, let's go to the questions. I can, you know, if we can do closing remarks at the end, you know, if there's anything else I want to say that wasn't covered.
Perfect. Okay, so the first question was, what about 1948? I know the character talks about his mother being a refugee, and as children asking the parents to take them to see her village, and they didn't want to. And then after they took you there, you felt shame that you had pressed for that, because it was obviously painful for your mother to see her home taken over by others. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, I wanted the book to be first person and eyewitness as much as possible, because that, to me, that personal immediate story is what communicates to the reader most effectively. And at the same time, I know that my character starts his life in 1973, many decades after 1948, after the Nakba, after his parents experienced that. So I have a chapter 4, which I call Inherited Memories. And that includes the character's reconstruction of what happened in 1948 through, stuff he read, through his interviews with his mother and other people later on in life. I tried to keep it as accurate historically as possible. My mother herself, she read over that chapter and gave me extensive comments. So, but the idea is that for my generation, the Nakba is not something we actually experienced. It's not something I could very effectively communicate because I didn't live through it. I cannot communicate it the same way someone who's actually lived through it could. So rather, I portray it as an inherited memory, as a collective experience that was passed down to us, that we still sort of experience in our DNA, but it's more vague. The way it feels like, someone from my generation, we're far removed, but then when you look at the West Bank hills, during the Nakba, my parents' story was that Jaffa was this big Arab city that gradually was surrounded by one Israeli settlement after another settlement after another. Well, back then they weren't called Israeli, they were Zionist. And eventually the city was isolated and was attacked, and people had to leave their homes because they were surrounded. And that character, who knows this story as something their parents told him, he then looks outside his window, and in the West Bank in Ramallah, there's a settlement that I could see from my school, and there's another settlement here, and there's another settlement here. Ramallah is equally surrounded by settlements, and those settlements are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So is 1948 really over, or is it still going on? And if you look at what's going on today, 1948, a repeat Nakba, is not that far off, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a very worrisome time right now. Now, we do have a lot of questions, so hopefully we can keep answers brief. Is this basically autobiographic?
Yes. I changed names and I changed some, trivial things, but most of the main events that are described are all happened as described.
Okay, so. All right, there's some comments here about the Nakba. And somebody wrote, it is my understanding that even Jews that were already living in Palestine before 1947-48 were forced out of their homes. Is that the case to your knowledge?
You mean like forced by the Israelis? Or
I'm not sure what the person
yeah,
meant.
I'm not, I wouldn't know.
I haven't heard about that. Okay. All right, let's see what else we got here. The book sounds fabulous. Yes, it is fabulous. Oh, props for the iNakba app about destroyed Palestinian villages. All right. So people are saying that the government leaders take money from Israel to get reelected, thus the US refusal to counter Israel. Well, they can't take money from Israel directly, but they certainly take money from many of Israel's partisans. All right, asking for links to the information I gave on genealogy. Mike, you're going to have to do that research yourself. I'm a very busy woman, but it is interesting, right?
I did not go into the genealogy in the book because I really don't have the information.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's relevant, really.
Well, okay.
Whoever is living on the land is living on the land. You can't just take them out because of something that happened 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the point of view of the person you're trying to persuade. All right, is there a risk by referring to Israel-Palestine as the Holy Land, removing the living Palestinians from the land and putting into the ancient past instead of the current present? I love that question.
Absolutely.
To my pastor, you could just solve this problem by calling it the Holy Land. He said, well, there's some problems with that too. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
I actually don't use the Holy Land. I think the Holy Land is a Christian Zionist concept that was created before Zionism. It was like second half of the 1800s. That's when you started seeing maps pop out with Holy Land, and they would have the land segmented as according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So you have Dan and Naphtali and Reuben and all those other places. And to me, that seems like a European attempt to reject the existing Arabic names of the places and impose a biblical map on, it's a conquest. It's a name of conquest,
All
It's
right.
the same as calling it Israel. It's a Christian Israel type of name.
All right, so Ryan presented a Haaretz article talking about what the genetic roots issue. And
Thanks.
Gretchen wrote, Gideon Levy took a DNA test and found out he wasn't Middle Eastern. There was an article in Haaretz by him about that, but I could only access the beginning of it due to paywall. Well, that's interesting. All right, and they want to know where you live now.
I live in Maryland near Washington, D.C.
Okay, great. And there's thank yous. We obviously have a friendly crowd here. No hate mail yet. The Nakba is not yet finished. Ongoing Nakba. 1948 was indeed the start of the Nakba with all the ethnocide that was entailed. Clearances began even before 1948 with the connivance of the British mandate. The progressive Judaization of the land and continuous repression of all that is Palestinian speaks to me that the Nakba continues today. Yes. And that is something that activists are talking about more and more. Oh, and somebody suggested we could call it the land of the Holy One. And Sabine replied, that is what they use. How do you feel about that?
You mean like it's a translation of Israel?
I never thought of it like that. Is that a translation of Israel? I mean, El means God. What does Israel mean?
I don't know.
If anybody knows, put it in the chat. I think the point here is just to point out that Palestine is Jesus' homeland.
Oh, if you actually look at the book, I have a map that there's a physical map that I got from somewhere, and there's a hand-drawn map that I made myself I label it, I don't call it Palestine or Israel. I just say map of the locations mentioned in the book.
Okay.
So again, my own point of view is that things like names, flags, national anthems, and all that stuff does not really matter. We are all people, we are all human beings. And if those symbols are going to make us kill each other, then maybe we should rethink those symbols and names.
Well, symbols don't make anybody kill anybody, but they could thoughts for sure, for the justifications. All right, so John Klein Hexel asked, how long will Bibi's administration last? Can the opposition prevail? The Jewish nation first people seem strong now.
You mean in the Israeli government, or?
Probably not your area of expertise.
Well, I mean, that's my fundamental message in the book. If there is to be a message, is that Palestine was dispossessed 75 years ago. For 55 years, that occupation has gone. There's people in the West Bank and Gaza who, were born under occupation. Their children were born under occupation. Their grandchildren are born under occupation, and it never ends. When you look at a place like Ukraine, they're having it hard with that war. But how long has that war gone on? A year? I hope that it will be solved soon. I hope that it will end. I hope that everyone who was made a refugee will go back to their homes. But that's nothing compared to the length of time that people in Palestine were sitting in that prison occupied. So the question is, how many more children are we going to let repeat Samir's story? And that's not a responsibility on Israel or on the USA or on Palestinians, on the whole world. The whole world system is condoning this and allowing it to go on and doing, business as usual with this apartheid government in Israel. And
yes. And my opinion is that the real anti-Semitism on this issue is, and keeping in mind that both Arabs and Jews are Semitic, the real anti-Semitism is when people dismiss both sides and say something like, oh, those people have been fighting for hundreds of years or thousands of years, which is absurd.
it's wrong.
And yeah, it's completely wrong and based on their misreading of biblical history. But those people are crazy. That's the anti-Semitism, to dismiss the very real concerns of both sides.
And one thing you look at is the rise of radicalism in Israel and how more Israelis are become fascists essentially. And,
yes.
Well, 20 years ago, before the wall, my generation, before the checkpoints, even 30 years ago, we could go to Jerusalem and we could see Israelis outside their uniform. We could go to their shops. They would come to Ramallah, and we would see each other as human beings. Since then, a whole generation of Palestinians, those under 20 or 30, they know Israelis only as soldiers or settlers who are carrying a big gun and shooting at us. And young Israelis, they know Palestinians only through their service maintaining the occupation, which, when you think about it, every Israeli's first job out of school is to be an armed jailer carrying a gun and maintaining that occupation. So is it any surprise that today's Israeli society is more extreme than 20 years ago? No, it's designed to be extreme by that wall. It's designed because they prevent them from talking to us and seeing us as human beings.
Very good point. Now, what do you suggest that we call the country? Palestine/Israel or something else?
I'm going to abstain on that question. I don't think it's relevant.
Okay.
Call it, nothing.
Interesting. Okay. And thank you to Paul and Alan, who told us that Israel means one who wrestled with God, or wrestles with God, which is another response to evangelicals. Israel in the Bible is referring to the Hebrew people. It is not referring to a country. So Israel, when the Bible says those who love Israel praise God, or whatever it is, I forget the exact verse, that means be kind to the Jews. Doesn't mean you have to love a nation state or support a nation state. And we should all be kind to everyone. Obviously, that's what Jesus taught us. It's not about your sect. All right. So David Turawa Mazen Kamsia wrote about the genetics in 2001, but learned journals refused to publish his findings. Interesting. Then somebody asked, do you think it will ever be known as Israel/Palestine?
No, I don't think people, I don't know. If it will ever be known like that, that would be a step forward.
Yeah. And then somebody said, no, it should be called Palestine, Israel.
Yeah, but you see my point. Like we have to come up with a totally different name, something that's like has nothing to do with the past and has more to do with the future.
Oh, there.
Um,
That's a great idea. All right. What is your favorite Bible story?
Together land, happy land, love land.
Awesome. So, what is your favorite Bible story?
Oh, probably Joseph.
Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat?
I don't know about the dream code, but I know it's a great story about forgiveness and love and how that triumphs in the end.
Wonderful. Yeah. He forgave his brothers who had put him in the well. That's what you're referring to, right?
Right.
Wonderful. And then this is the last question, then we're going to wrap up. Why was the name Judah dropped? Judea. I don't think it was dropped. They still use it in Israel, referring to part of the West Bank.
Judea and Samaria. That's what they call the West Bank.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think it's a question of not trying to change the landscape to fit different ideologies. Instead, a real respect for the Bible, I think, and for religion involves a real respect for God's creation, which includes the earth in its entirety, includes the climate, includes and includes that land, which if we really consider it holy, then we have to respect that land above everything else, not destroy it the way it's being done to massive construction projects, just bring in immigrants from Russia and stack them in those places where water is very scarce, and then tax the water system even more and import foreign trees to plant parks over Palestinian villages. And that kind of project is very disrespectful of the earth, and it's very disrespectful of God's creation. And if we really value that, our starting point from building a community together is to begin with that earth and help it heal.
Beautiful. I love your vision. All right.
Thank you.
It is noon, so I guess we can thank Sabil and Kumi for hosting us. Thank everybody for your wonderful questions and comments. Anything you wanted to say to send people on their way?
I'll read you one small paragraph from the book, from the very end of the book. And this is it again, Fugitive Dreams. I stopped bothering about their harassments at border crossings. I now gracefully endure the exorbitant and unreasonable tax in time and money it takes to travel to, from, and within Palestine. It no longer upsets me. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. The Jordanian guards, the Israelis, or the unscrupulous usurers exploiting the situation, from taxi drivers to porters, can all have their micro-power trips, but their domain ends there. They impede the world, not make it go. In that, I pity them. They choose to mask their creative impotence, flaunting an illusory power over people whose passports fall into their hands. In the same spirit, I began greeting the Israeli soldiers at the bridge. Quite disarming to be treated as human beings, especially when they put on their uniforms and insignia expressly to establish their authority over me. Even more disconcerting to them, by doing so, I am rejecting the subordinate role they assigned me, asserting instead my place as an equal. They claim authority to let me in or bar entry. They can delay, search, hassle, or detain me. They are stuck in that role, but I don't have to be. Treating them like human beings, emphasizing my lack of animosity towards them as individuals, I'm making my own statement of power. With their expecting hostility, my friendliness often gives them pause. In the face of their attempts to dehumanize me, my best means of resistance is to assert my humanity. That's all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And anything you wanted to tell folks about where to get the book?
It's available everywhere. You can find it on Amazon or any other bookstore online. If you have a favorite bookstore, you can take the ISBN number and order it.
All right. Well, Megan Sengodia wrote, thank you, Ramsey. It was a lesson on humility. That's beautiful. I wish you well. And Alice Goodman just bought your book. Judith
Thank you
Paul,
so much.
exactly what Jesus taught. Assert your kindness. Wonderful. All right, guys. Well, I'm glad we were able to provide you with a bit of a feel-good session. I know sometimes hearing about Palestine can be heavy on the heart, but hopefully this gave you a bit of a boost. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for attending. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you.